Japan, a top travel destination for many, thanks in part to its rich culture, deep history, and of course, its cuisine. But for over 2 years, it enacted some of the world's strictest border closures in order to combat the COVID-19 pandemic. These measures were relaxed a bit in the summer of 2022, though it still seemed like it would be a while before it was fully open to individual travelers. Then, seemingly out of nowhere, Prime Minister Kishida announced that the country was lifting all of its border restrictions. No travel visas, no guided tours, and no travel agencies needed. From October 11th, 2022, the floodgates were open. I, like many others, scrambled to book a flight and began planning out my visit immediately. What I ended up with was a mid-November trip across several prefectures, aiming to enjoy the autumn foliage and cram as much as I could into 2 weeks. After what seemed like an eternity of waiting, the time had finally come. Here's everything I managed to throw together, and hopefully it serves as inspiration if you're looking to visit as well. We started off our journey in Osaka, rightfully nicknamed the nation's kitchen. We arrived on a rainy Sunday evening, and after a 31-hour total commute, what better way to combat jet lag on a gloomy day than a hot bowl of ramen? The target was Makotoya, located in the Shinsaibashi neighborhood not too far from our hostel. And as a first meal, it did not disappoint. Our food stood little chance as we devoured it and immediately set out for our final destination for the night, teamLab Botanical Garden. Unlike the other teamLab exhibits in Tokyo, teamLab Osaka is actually outdoors. There were a good amount of displays, each different from the last. From triply illuminated flowers, to glowing eggs, to lanterns floating on a lake. Everything was a pleasure to observe. We ended up passing through the hipster Amerikamura neighborhood on the way back. It wasn't something I planned on going out of our way to visit, but walking through it once was nice. Most people tend to rest on their day of arrival, but not doing so actually helped us more than anything. We were able to sleep at a reasonable time in JST, counteracting the jet lag and allowing us to be up and at 'em early the next morning. Our second day started bright and early on the JR Kobe line. We decided to forego seeing Osaka Castle in favor of the grander Himeji Castle, about an hour's ride away. After exiting the station, it was immediately visible despite being over a mile down the road. And the closer we got, the more impressive it became. The view from the shores of its moat was amazing, and after admiring it for a bit, we finally headed inside. The castle itself is one of Japan's largest and oldest standing, dating all the way back to 1333, surviving even through several bombings and natural disasters. The inside was pretty barren and not all that interesting, but there were a few cool tidbits of history sprinkled in. Though I will say the vistas from the castle windows made up for this entirely. Making our way back down, we explored the castle grounds a bit more before doing one last thing in Himeji. For an extra 50 yen, or roughly 33 cents as of November 2022, you can purchase a dual ticket that also includes admission to Kokoen Garden down the street. Even for a much more expensive price, it would be well worth the visit. There were plenty of picturesque spots, including a plethora of flora and a koi pond. We actually did a bit of a speed run through the garden, as we had a very special lunch reservation on our way back to Osaka. One of the things most associated with Japan from a foreign perspective is Wagyu, and few breeds of cattle hold more prestige than the world-famous Kobe beef. By no means do you need to go to Kobe to find quality beef in Japan, but since it was on our way back, I figured we'd give it a shot. We went to a restaurant called Moriya in Sannomiya. Being A5 Wagyu, it was obviously expensive, but as a treat once in a blue moon, it was well worth it. Our chef was extremely friendly, giving us tips on what condiments to use and when. He was heavily amused by our reaction to the food, and I was even able to converse with him a bit in Japanese. We each ordered about 7 ounces of beef, and given how rich it was just the right amount. We left with perhaps the worst diagnosis of the itis in history, and went to explore the port town a bit more before leaving. Back in Osaka, we were supposed to visit the Umeda Sky Building Observatory for sunset. We made the trek over, only to realize the line was way too long, so we didn't mind simply admiring it from the ground and heading back for some much-needed rest. It was also our last night in Osaka, and we couldn't leave the city without going out for some drinks. Without going into too much detail, let's just say a lot happened.
California girls were unforgettable.
Kyoto, Japan's ancient capital and a city filled to the brim with history. Despite only being about half an hour from Osaka by train, getting there hungover proved to be quite the feat. Upon arrival, we still had a few hours before check-in, so I begrudgingly dragged myself to some of the things I had intended on doing pre-hangover. Our first stop was Gion and Hanami-Koji, famous for their more traditional streets and people walking around in kimono. Due to lots of rude tourists in the past, most of Hanami-Koji prohibits photography. But at the end of it, we wandered into a temple that wasn't initially on our checklist, Kenninji, the first of many. Unbeknownst to me, it's actually one of the 5 most important Zen temples in Kyoto, and being constructed in 1202, it's the oldest as well. It was rather small compared to some of the behemoths we'd see in the coming days, but we did get a sneak peek at some of the autumn foliage. We only had one more thing on our list for the day, but on the way there, I paid admission into Kodaiji for their bathroom. There was actually quite a bit to see, including several gardens, and a shrine at the end. After finally relieving myself, we made our way over to Yasakadori for the sunset. Our first of several iconic views of Kyoto. There were a ton of people, but this was something I absolutely did not want to miss. We spent a bit taking in the view before turning in early to prepare for the first of several consecutive early starts. The following morning was our earliest thus far. We were up at sunrise to visit all the attractions in Arashiyama before the crowds. First up was the bamboo forest. Being one of the most Instagrammable spots, it's insanely popular among tourists. There weren't many people there at the same time as us, so we were able to explore it unbothered. Adjacent to the bamboo grove is Tenryuji Temple, a UNESCO World Heritage Site. It got cloudy while we were looking around, and it even started raining a bit despite weather forecasts to the contrary. The rain had let up by the time we were done, and after heading back across the river, the main road was packed with tourists and domestic travelers alike. As difficult as it was, the early start definitely paid off. The opposite side of the Katsura River housed two attractions that were on our radar. The closer one was Arashiyama Monkey Park, a mountaintop sanctuary for Japanese macaques. The hike to the top was rather cumbersome, but arriving at the summit immediately reveals why this is the case. You're met with a panoramic view over Kyoto, with a huge open area where the monkeys can roam freely. I thanked my lucky stars that I decided to bring my telephoto lens at the last minute. This allowed me to observe the monkeys from a safe distance before heading inside the feeding area to check yet another thing off my bucket list. Interacting with the monkeys was both engaging and entertaining, but we still had one more thing to do in Arashiyama before setting our sights onto other stuff. From the monkey park, a 30-minute walk along the river and a short hike up the mountain stands Senkoji Temple, complete with a shrine dog. It was small, quaint, tucked away, and not nearly as tourist-packed as the other attractions in the area. It did have a nice view of the river, as well as a bell that everyone was allowed to ring 3 times. It was a short visit, so we headed back down the mountain, along the river, and into Arashiyama Station to visit our last temple for the day, Kinkakuji. A lot of Japanese temples can start to feel samey once you've seen enough of them, but Kinkakuji is impossible to lump into this category. Officially known as Rokuonji, the original temple burned down in 1950. It has since been restored to look how it does today, with the gold leaf giving it the nickname Kinkakuji. Thank you, Kaon, for teaching me this information. We went in the evening, so there was a bit of a crowd, but the sun shone right on the pavilion itself, which definitely enhanced the viewing experience. There wasn't too much else in the temple. We quickly finished, ate a bit, and prepared for the last of the Kyoto heavy hitters. Up at sunrise once again, this time we started at Fushimi Nari Taisha, renowned for its thousands of red torii gates. Climbing to the top wasn't awful, but it wasn't all too pleasant either. All that awaited us was a sign and a shrine. The way down was fortunately much easier, and we were greeted by some local cats. Next up was Eikando Temple, which had an autumn special going on, and accordingly had the largest density of momiji we had seen. It had some great gardens, along with a pagoda of its own. Neighboring Eikando is Nanzenji, the site of a huge temple gate and an aqueduct. Following the crowd led us up and along the aqueduct, but what I didn't realize was that it takes you far away from the temple. The trail went on for a while until we ended up at some train tracks. We didn't have the energy to make it back to the temple to see the rest of it, and although it was only the early afternoon, we retired for the day to catch up on sleep. Our last day in Kyoto was actually not really spent in Kyoto. We took a day trip to visit Nara, known for Nara Park, its deer population, and the vast Todaiji Temple. Immediately after climbing the station stairs, we were met by dozens of deer. It seemed like they knew that people were an easy source of food. They were constantly headbutting, following, and biting the clothes of anyone who purchased the 200 yen crackers. Tanner and I were targeted as well, and as poor as their manners may have been, it was still a 10 out of 10 experience. A straight shot down the road led to Nara Park. We chilled out a bit before heading into Todaiji, another UNESCO World Heritage Site. Inside was Nara's famous Daibutsuden, or Great Buddha Hall. It's home to the world's largest bronze statue of the Buddha Vairocana, known in Japanese as Daibutsu. After checking out the rest of Todaiji, we went to complete the last item on our Nara checklist, climbing Mount Wakakusa. By this point, I had seen more than enough stairs, but as was often the case, the hike was worth the view. In spite of the name, Mount Wakakusa is actually a hill, about 1,100 feet at its highest point, so the trek up wasn't too bad. There are 3 different peaks, each offering a different view of Nara and the surrounding area. From above, we could see Todaiji, the city of Nara, and even some of the neighboring farmland. The trail down the south end was much more forgiving, so we headed back to the foot of the hill and got on the first train back to Kyoto to cross one last thing off the itinerary. Postponed a few days due to cloudy weather, I wanted to see Kiyomizu-dera, one of the best autumn foliage spots, at sunset. Unfortunately for us, many other people had the same exact idea. We rushed inside to catch the sunset, barely seeing it before it disappeared behind the hills. Getting a picture in its most iconic spot was difficult, but the spectacle of being there at this time of year and at this time of day was still immensely satisfying. On our way out, we participated in Chozuya, the Japanese hand-washing ritual, before having a special dinner for our last night in Kyoto. Zayoshoku Yakichi shouldn't need an introduction. It specializes in yoshoku, or Western-inspired cuisine, and its owner, Chef Yukimura Motokichi, has become an internet sensation. His flashy theatrics and unique spin on omurice has resulted in him being covered by all sorts of media, most notably BuzzFeed's Worth It. Past a certain point, people will start knocking places like this for being tourist traps, but I'd argue it's worth the price of admission. Chef Yukimura's energy is seemingly limitless. He prepares his renowned omurice the same exact way for everyone who orders it, probably hundreds of times a day. For that alone, he's deserving of the respect he gets.
ローリングします。コロコロコロコロコロコロね。はい、ではトントム。ではこのままいったショータイムね。スーパーナイフですね。レディーコーナー&コーナーね。デミグラスソース、ビター&スイーツ。はい、キチキチオムライス、with my smile, oh yeah. オムライス。
ありがとう。
はい、here areコーナー&コーナー。ね、デミグラスソース。はい、ビター&スイーツ、キチキチオムライス。Very delicious and very famous. Oh, right.
As for my experience, I was more impressed with the show than the dinner. The omurice wasn't mind-blowingly good, but the ox tongue stew, the chef's personal favorite dish, was amazing. Overall, it was a very wholesome meal. We left with our hearts full, our stomachs not so much, and prepared to head to Tokyo the next day. Tokyo, a modern megacity and the centerpiece of most people's visit to Japan. We were no different, allocating half of our time to the nation's capital. Rather tired from our long-ish commute, we weren't in the mood to do much. We spent a good chunk of the afternoon wandering through the nearby Shinjuku-gyoen National Garden. I was a little baffled at paying to enter using my IC card, but there was plenty to see once inside. As an aside, you'll notice our days in Tokyo weren't nearly as jam-packed as those prior. By this point, we were pretty burnt out due to all the cramming we did across the other cities. From here on, we decided to switch up the tempo of our trip and take things a little slower. With a bit more time on our hands, there was something else I wanted to do, and it wasn't too far from the west end of the garden. Suga Jinja Shrine is probably not a name you'll hear on most travel sites, but it's notable for a different reason. It's the location of the stairs from the hit Shinkai film Kimi no Na wa. It was tucked away in a quieter part of Yotsuya, but there were actually a decent amount of people that came to see it as well. After getting a creative idea for a photo, we headed over to a dinner reservation and one of Tokyo's most iconic landmarks. Since we were in the area, we walked on over to Tokyo Tower. One of the best photo spots of it happens to be the stairs of a nearby parking garage. We managed to get a nice one of ourselves and may or may not have done a funny on some Korean tourists that were taking a bit too long before us. It was a chill day when compared to the rest of the trip, but we still got a lot done. Our 8th day was the first of several where we ended up getting rained out. Luckily, the main thing we had planned was indoors, Team Lab Planets. I had seen plenty of pictures and videos of it before, but even then I was pleasantly surprised. I thoroughly enjoyed each and every exhibit, and they recently added a second section for when you're done with the main one. It took us around an hour and a half to finish entirely, and by the time we were done, the rain was coming down pretty hard. Afterwards, we checked out of our hotel and into our hostel, long story, and had a pretty uneventful night, except...
Not the underneath yet. And that's just down there. You know they're coming fast and you need heels to prepare. I got V-Bucks that I'll spend, more than you can contend. I'm a pro Fortnite gamer, Xbox to play Fortnite too.
In what was the latest we had slept in thus far, but also relatively early, we headed out to Toshima with a very specific restaurant in mind. Nakiryu, currently Japan's only Michelin-starred ramen restaurant. There are only a handful of seats inside, so we waited about an hour to be seated. Since the weather was actually rather nice, the wait went by quickly. Before long, we were inside the restaurant ordering at the ticket machine. After the world's longest 10 minutes, the food finally arrived in front of us. They specialize in shoyu ramen, and as someone whose favorite style of ramen is shoyu, this place seemed to be right up my alley. The long and the short of it was that it was extremely good, but to me, ramen is like pizza, hard to be upset with when done properly. Was it the best ramen I've ever had? It's up there, but it wasn't so far ahead that I can hand it that crown definitively. The afternoon was dedicated to a bit of shopping. We walked over to Ikebukuro, a shopping district with otaku goods aplenty, as well as the huge Sunshine City shopping mall. I expected to spend a small fortune here, but left underwhelmed with what I found. Nakano Broadway was also on our schedule, but I figured it'd be more of the same, so instead we headed back to our hostel. Following a long night out, we had little time for rest before we had to catch an early morning bus to Fujiyoshida. There were really only two things we wanted to see before kicking it back at our ryokan, but thanks to the lack of widespread public transportation, we had to walk between each of them. After an hour of wandering through quiet residential streets, we made it to Arakurayama Sengen Park, whose name might not ring a bell, but the view from the lookout probably does. The leaves at the base of the hill perfectly framed Japan's biggest natural wonder. At the top, we got to bask in the esteemed view of the park's pagoda. Running on less than optimal sleep, we took a breather on the benches for a while. As we did so, clouds started to roll in. The forecast predicted heavy clouds the entire day, so we were thankful to see the mountain at all. By the time we made our way back down, it was entirely engulfed in clouds. We would have loved to pass out in our ryokan by this point, but unfortunately we had to wait until the evening to check in. Thus, we dragged ourselves over to Lake Kawaguchi, knowing full well that we wouldn't be seeing much while there. Maps took us through a 2.5 kilometer long tunnel, and due to the way it curved, we couldn't see the light at the end. I'm not sure how long we spent inside, but it was easily a bottom 3 moment of the trip. Once we escaped, there was only a little more to go before the lake. As expected, it got even cloudier. You could hardly differentiate Mount Fuji from the surrounding hills. Sparing ourselves the trouble of walking fully around the lake, it was finally time to head to our ryokan. It was actually pretty far from Kawaguchiko, but they did offer a free shuttle from the station. The caveat was that I had to call to confirm our pickup, and after telling me they had no English-speaking staff available, my broken Japanese was fully put to the test. I managed to make it through the conversation and hung up feeling rather proud of myself. We were staying in a Japanese-style room, complete with tatami floors, futons, a kotatsu, and the main attraction, a private onsen. After a long day of walking 16 miles, I took what was easily the most therapeutic bath I have ever taken. We were also provided with some complimentary cultural appropriation. They told us we either had to wear a yukata or samue for the duration of our stay, so we went with the more casual samue and did a bit of exploring. This was a place I randomly found on Hotels.com, and to my surprise, it was actually massive. There was a huge garden, a public open-air bath, live performances, and a bunch of other facilities like banquet halls and karaoke rooms. We caught a quick drum show before heading back to our room, where I did a bit of editing from the warmth of the kotatsu before completely passing out. Heavy rain persisted throughout the entire following day, so we headed back to Shinjuku and stayed inside for most of it. Though we did meet some new people in the hostel and went out for some drinks and karaoke. Oh yeah, and we also got to witness Japan beating Germany in the World Cup.
This would be amazing if Germany loses. I would be so pumped.
The following day was spent mostly in Akihabara, the electric town and the mecca for weebs across the globe. We started off in arcades, where I spent entirely too much money on crane games.
Yes. Fuck yes. I did it. I only spent like $300 on crane.
We also messed around with some of the other games before doing some shopping. Maybe I didn't look hard enough, but I didn't manage to find much merchandise of interest. Before heading back to the hostel, we visited Ameya Yokocho, an alley lined with dozens of smaller shops and restaurants. While there, we were randomly interviewed by Bloomberg Japan about inflation in Japan compared to the US, though to this day I still haven't seen the results. We returned to Shinjuku, where we made some poor decisions, and Tanner and I had separate but interesting nights. Friday was our penultimate full day in Japan. Tanner was incapacitated for pretty much the entire day, so I enlisted the company of our good friend Joa. There wasn't all that much left that I still wanted to see, so our day was centered around Shibuya. The morning was spent visiting Yoyogi Park and Meiji Jingu Shrine. It was a chill morning stroll, but by this point I had seen enough shrines and parks. Lunch was something I had reserved far in advance and was the last Wagyu I'd eat while in Japan. Wagyu Mafia in Meguro does Wagyu Katsu Sandos. It's a hole in the wall with only 4 seats, and the guy working there was super friendly. He gave us a rundown on the different types of beef and proceeded to cook up our sandwiches.
Welcome to Wagyu Mafia, Osaka sirloin sandwich. Itterashoi!
I will say that this was probably my least favorite of the 3 Wagyu meals I had. It was still good and was something I wanted to try for the experience, but you can easily get a majority of the quality for a fraction of the price. The next thing on our plate was Shibuya Sky, one of the best observation decks in Tokyo. We reunited with Kirk and headed up the skyscraper's 47 floors just in time for sunset. On our way up, we got some pretty sweet views of Shibuya Crossing, and on the roof, some of Tokyo's tallest landmarks were visible. We waited for a while to have our photo taken at one of the photo spots, and after seeing everyone repeat the same 3 poses, I had an epiphany, and ours turned out pretty creative. As the sun sank beneath the horizon, the silhouette of Mount Fuji became visible. We stayed a bit longer to see some of the nighttime lights, and there were a few mini exhibits to see on the way down. In desperate need for some more B-roll, we crossed the crossing over to Mag's Park rooftop for some food and drinks. It offers a pretty solid view of Shibuya Crossing and is magnitudes less crowded than the Starbucks across the street. We sat around for a while and then went our separate ways, but wanting to make the most of my last Friday in Japan, Kirk and I later went out for a bit. Regretfully, I spent our last full day in bed. It was raining again, and none of the things left for me to do would have been enjoyable in the rain. After 13 days of doing as much as humanly possible, I indulged myself with one last day of rest. That isn't to say we didn't do anything, however, as Tanner and I were not going out without a bang. We went on the Tokyo Pub Crawl, a popular weekly event where you go to 3 bars and a club with a large group. It started off very slow, and I found myself wondering if we would have been better off clubbing with the gang from the hostel instead. But by the time we made it to the 3rd bar, things were finally starting to kick up. If you haven't realized by now, karaoke is kind of our thing. And Tanner was selected to participate in a karaoke-off.
And I say, I want it that way. Tell me why ain't nothing but a heartache. Tell me why ain't nothing but a mistake. Tell me why I never wanna hear you say, I want it that way.
In a landslide victory, Tanner won a free drink, and there is even a pretty funny photo of me cheering him on. The club was a blast. I hung out with some awesome new people, including 4 other Allens, and we ended up staying all the way until they closed. When we made it back to the hostel, we had to leave for the airport in less than an hour. Even so, this may have been the perfect way to cap off our trip. From the bustling downtown of Osaka, to the more traditional sights of Kyoto, to the peaceful Mount Fuji, to the megacity of Tokyo, I'd say my first trip to Japan was an overwhelming success. We did just about everything we set out to do, and aside from a few letdowns, everything went as well as I had hoped. I learned a lot, not only about travel, but also about myself. I met a bunch of amazing new people, and my only regret is that we didn't have more time. For me personally, a trip to Japan had been brewing for the better part of 4 years, though COVID threw quite the wrench into those plans. But it's 2022, and the country is open and as good as ever. Now that I've finally done it, I'm more than eager to come back. To anyone in the process of planning out their first trip, I hope this video has been informative. And to anyone on the fence about going to Japan, I have but 2 words for you. Send it.